Hello and welcome again to another exciting instalment of Lost in Science across Australia on the Community Radio Network. My name is Stu, and on this week's show I'm going to have a look into the effect of diet on the climate, well, on the environment really. So
do you mean like what you eat affects the climate? Like,
it's really what the production of what we eat and how that impacts the climate. So, you know, whether you eat more dairy or whether you eat more meat or whether you eat more, fish. Soy. Yeah, all those things. And
if you eat carbon dioxide, then you're actually contributing to alleviating climate change.
The plants all eat carbon dioxide, so
exactly.
we can, maybe take something from their book. We can't obviously turn carbon dioxide into sugar like they can, which would be very handy.
It would be handy, wouldn't it?
If we could get some of those CRISPR kits and figure out a way to genetically modify ourselves to directly make sugar from the atmosphere, that would be awesome.
I hope we've inspired someone somewhere.
It may be a long way off from that ideal world. Claire, what have you got for us?
Well, I have a special guest in this week. Dr. Stephen Davis is a mathematics lecturer at RMIT and also a research investigator, and he's going to come in and talk to us a bit about his research. So he looks at how disease spread through populations of animals and humans. So sort of like epidemiology, but looking at the mathematics behind it. And in particular, he's been brought in to look at how the herpes virus is how the government is planning to spread the herpes virus through the population of invasive carp. So that's the fish carp within the Murray-Darling.
So does he look at how infective it is and how quickly it will progress through the population?
Exactly.
And potentially, if it's quicker, it's better because they can't develop resistance and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's what we will talk about. It's a little bit difficult because there's so many carp in the Murray-Darling Basin. It's something like 80% of the biomass is carp. So you don't want it to happen too quickly because then you've got a lot of dead fish in a waterway and you need to remove those dead fish really, really quickly. So Stephen's all about modelling how quickly it's going to spread through the population and what they can do, what sort of, checks and balances that they can put in place to make sure that, it doesn't have any wider effects on the rest of the ecosystem. And he's also just been in Canberra at a conference where one of the main aims of the conference is to see how many trucks it's going to take to remove all the carp from the river. So that is going to be my first question.
The second question is, where will they take them all?
Where will they take them
I don't want to be downwind from there.
Yeah, besieged politician Barnaby Joyce. This was really his thing, this carp virus. So it's all very interesting to talk about it now, and what's going to happen.
Well, sounds super interesting, and I can't wait to hear what he has to say about the carp problem and the solution, potentially. On with the show. There's a lot of discussion about human impacts on the planet that goes around, and specifically our greenhouse gas emissions and their effect on the climate.
Yeah, our carbon footprint.
Yeah, that's one way people like to talk about it. So it's pretty clear that industrial burning of fossil fuels energy is the main driver of greenhouse gas emissions around the world, coal being among the biggest producers of carbon dioxide specifically. While some people have argued that the use of fossil fuels have provided greater benefits for people than it has caused problems for them, it's pretty difficult to measure that without knowing what the final impact is going to be.
Absolutely.
You know, in the we don't really know what's going to happen in the future, so it's an unbalanced argument. We can know what it's done for us, but we can't necessarily what it will do to us in the end. But one obvious measure of improvement in human lives is economic development. And the income of the majority of people in the world has increased since industrialization, which is when we started burning fossil fuels at much greater rates than we ever had before.
Yeah, a huge achievement.
Yeah. And this has brought about a related but slightly more complex problem. As people get wealthier, their diet changes.
Okay. For the better or the more nutritious?
Well, it's just different.
Turns into hamburgers?
Well, the biggest and most obvious change is the tendency of people to eat more meat and dairy products as their wealth increases.
Sure.
So these are the more expensive foods. They're very nutrient-dense foods, so there's nothing not nutritious about them. They are very nutritious foods. But the impact of that change in diet on the planet is a lot more difficult to measure directly. So this Western diet that people sort of tend to shift towards basically contains more meat per head of population and more dairy per person each year than traditional diets in places like Asia and India and Africa, and also a greater percentage or a greater proportion of highly processed foods as well. But it's generally accepted that diets with a higher meat and dairy content contribute to greater greenhouse gas emissions per capita than more plant-based diets. So people have actually done this work, and there are numerous studies that have been carried out around the world measuring the relative impact of different diets on greenhouse gas emissions, and they have shown some clear differences. But they've all been separate studies looking at very specific situations, and different people have measured different things. So in a review published in November 2016 in PLOS One, which is the online journal, the review was called The Impacts of Dietary Change on Greenhouse Gas Emissions, Land Use, Water Use and Health, a Systematic Review. They attempted to combine data from 63 studies on the impact of diet on the environment, and they were able to compare 210 separate diet scenarios. So 210 different kinds of diet from these 63 different studies. They were also, as I said, they were looking at health as well, so health factors, and there was some interesting stuff came out of that. But a lot of the dietary guidelines that a lot of governments issue are based more on health than they are on the environment. So some of the studies that they were looking at...
are any based on the environment?
Not officially, you know. So there's a lot of, government information about diet, which is generally about your health and well-being rather than the health and well-being of the planet.
Yeah,
which is,
are you going to be a drain on the health system
Well,
rather than are you going to be a drain on the environment?
That's right. And I guess this is an accounting issue. Nobody does the accounting for what the damage to the environment's going to cost later on. So it's one of the reasons it's probably not.
Unfortunate truth.
Absolutely. But the greenhouse gas emissions, land use and water use they're three pretty big measures that you can actually directly apply to the environment. So for the most part, they found that diets which use less animal products, either meat or dairy based, showed lower emissions and lower land use by area and lower water use, generally speaking. So vegan diets came in the top, which use no animal products at all. They had a median of 45% reduction in greenhouse gases.
That's huge.
It's quite huge.
Wow.
Some was a lot less, and the statistical variation was quite massive as well. So some of it barely changed the greenhouse gas emissions, and some of it changed it far more than 45% into the negative. So it's quite a huge range of things. It depends specifically what they ate, though. Also, generally lower land use by area, but because the limitations of the studies that they were using, it actually showed that they had higher water use than other kinds of diet, which may seem a little bit incongruous, but
did they explain why they saw that?
part of the reason is the numbers were quite low. So the number of studies of vegan diets was relatively small compared to other kinds of diets. So there's, Mediterranean diet and various different other diets that they looked at. Vegetarian diets also showed a reduction around 30% lower than current levels of greenhouse gas emissions as a median figure. Similar reduction in land use and a reduction in water use by an average of 37%. So vegetarian diets are those which avoid meat but still include animal products like dairy and eggs. But that's big reductions.
That's a big reduction.
Reasonable reductions in water use and in greenhouse gas emissions, dropping by about a third. Now, did
they break the diets down further into specific types of animals included in the diets? Like, a diet with fish and chicken compared with one that included beef as well, or anything?
Well, they actually isolated the pescatarian diet.
They did, yeah.
Which allows fish and often eggs and dairy, but no red meat or chicken or other meat animals included in that diet. They found that produced also lower greenhouse gas emissions and used less land and less water than other diets as well. So that was an advantage as well. So they noticed that even simply reducing meat intake, as in not cutting it out altogether, seemed to have some effect on environmental factors on average. But of course, in statistical analysis, the average doesn't always tell the whole story. So in several European studies and one North American case study, removing meat and dairy and replacing it with certain specific plant-based foods showed higher water and land use and higher greenhouse gas emissions. So it depends what you're substituting.
Can you be a bit more specific?
They weren't specific enough in their paper, but it's an interesting thing. But if they're talking about,
they've been substituting it with.
Well, I guess if they're substituting it with things like nuts rather than things like pulses or other sources of protein, then certainly nuts are very high water users. But it's an interesting anomaly, I guess, rather than, I would say, a trend, because they did identify there was only, I think, 6 or 7 specific studies looking at specific food sources.
Sure.
And also interesting that it was in Europe. So they were talking about France and Germany, which are relatively small countries with very dense populations. So maybe that has something to do with it. So, and this is the difficulty with looking at larger environmental pictures, is that if we're talking about specific locations and specific situations, then where those people get their food may not actually be where they live anyway. So what they import is, impacting the environment somewhere else than they live in the first place. So it's pretty tricky. They did also look at the type of meat being consumed. They found that poultry and pigs have less environmental impact than ruminants like cattle.
Sure. I mean, you need less land. It's intensive farming.
And, also the cattle and the methane issue. The cattle produce methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas. They did, of course, make it CO2 equivalent. So the amount of methane produced, they broke it down as if it was the same amount of carbon dioxide, so they could compare like with like. But, as you say, the high intensity production of these animals wasn't really addressed as an issue because, there's obviously different concerns with high intensity production of animals. There's ethical concerns and animal cruelty concerns, which are not part of this study whatsoever. So they were saying, oh yeah, well, you could eat more pork, but a lot of people might go, well, I don't want to eat more pork because that's a different issue altogether. But yeah, so it's clear that regional differences can make a difference to how effective dietary change can be in producing widespread environmental improvements. So while less land may be used to produce food for individual people, it won't necessarily be the same farmland that's currently being used for meat or dairy production because, for example, grazing land uses a lot less water or receives a lot less rainfall than areas that produce crops. And so the farmers who own grazing land can't just sort of switch over
Of course, yeah.
to producing rain-fed or irrigated crops. But it's pretty clear from this study. It is a really interesting study. And if you want to read it, there's a lot more detail in there than I've had time to go into
We
today.
will post a link to it on the Lost in Science on 3CR page.
Absolutely, we will. And but it's pretty clear from the study that for most people in most places, eating less meat and dairy will produce less greenhouse gas emissions for them personally. But if other consumers step in to take their place, then the personal dietary choices that people make might not actually be enough pressure to drive the necessary reduction in environmental impact that diets are having. So, people are still getting richer. So, people who didn't used to eat these things are starting to be able to afford them, and they've got not necessarily got a reason not to buy them. So, yeah, it's a very interesting field to look into. So, absolutely have a read of the paper if you've got the time. Across Australia on the Community Radio Network, you're listening to Lost in Science.
So remember last year when Barnaby Joyce was a little less besieged and talking about releasing a carp herpes virus into the Murray-Darling to deal with the invasive species, the carpfish? This was also known as Carpageddon, some people might remember. Well, my guest today, Dr. Stephen Davis from RMIT University, is one of the scientists preparing for the possible release of the carp herpes virus. And today he's going to give us an insight into where Carpageddon is at the moment. Stephen, welcome to Lost in Science.
Thank you, Claire.
So, can you tell us a little bit more about the carp cleanup, about Carpageddon, and what your involvement is?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'm a mathematician and I'm a specialist in using mathematics to model infectious diseases and their dynamics. So how they spread and how they establish and how infectious they are.
You are working with the fun stuff.
Yes.
The infectious diseases.
Yeah, I'm all about infectious disease agents, pathogens, viruses, bacteria.
And obviously not just in human populations.
No, so I'm actually a specialist in wildlife disease.
That is pretty cool, Stephen.
Yeah. My big vision is to try to improve the scientific basis for the management of wildlife disease. And so this potential release of a herpes virus is particularly interesting and particularly exciting to be involved with, actually.
Are you one of many scientists helping to look at whether this is a good idea to release this herpes virus into the carp population?
Yeah, so absolutely. So there's a whole range of fields that are involved here. So I work with virologists at the Australian Animal Health Laboratory. There are hydrologists involved because it's all about a river system. So water flows actually play a huge role in just the movement of the fish and the likely spread of the virus throughout the catchment. There are also people looking at how dead fish decay and rot and how that affects the water quality as well.
So for people who might not live near the Murray-Darling River Basin, how much of an issue is carp in that system?
Yeah, so they've had a huge impact. They're regarded mostly as disgusting. And Barnaby Joyce would call them mud-sucking fish. And they do. This is called roiling, actually. And
Roiling?
Roiling is the technical term.
That's a good word.
And that refers to the way they feed on the bottom of the river. And I was out there in the Lachlan catchment recently, and you could see this fish feeding and sending up a cloud of mud and dirt, and just the visibility in the water is terrible. So they have a huge impact, and they're reaching up to 90% of the biomass in some parts of the river system. Yeah.
So that is a huge amount of biomass.
Yes. 90% is huge. So if you go fishing in some parts of the Murray-Darling, you only catch carp. And, they're huge. They're big.
How?
And they're ugly.
And they also don't taste very good, right?
Yeah, that's right. So because they feed on the bottom of the river and they suck all of this mud into their system, they taste like mud. So some people do eat them still, but that requires you to put them in a bath for 3 days and, let the
flush them out.
Yeah, they flush the mud out of their
Flushed carp.
flesh. Yeah.
Oh, right. So you were talking about you do mathematical modelling of how disease spreads through wildlife.
Yes.
So in this case, it's releasing a herpes virus, which is currently not in the Australian biota, currently not in the environment, putting it into the environment to specifically kill the carp.
Yeah.
We know that it's not going to kill anything else, do we?
Yeah, that's very well tested. So at the Animal Health Laboratory, they have looked at the species specificity of this virus, and it is extremely species specific. You will not infect anything else except carp. Yeah, and that's been, experimentally proven.
And so in terms of the modelling that you've done, can you tell us a little bit about that and maybe your preliminary modelling and what you hope for?
Yeah, sure. So there are two purposes to using mathematical modelling to look at the behaviour of this virus once it's released. The first one is to advise the Australian government on, what are the likely long-term impacts of this virus. If we decide to release it, what are the benefits that are going to come? How effective is the virus going to be in reducing the abundance of carp and improving the health of the rivers? And that's something that mathematical modelling is really good for, because you can make long-term predictions without doing any experiments, right? You don't have to actually release the virus to advise on the likely consequences of it. The second aspect is strategic modelling. So the idea is that the virus will be first released in the Lachlan catchment, which is in New South Wales. And, there you're asking questions about where in the catchment should we release the virus? When? What sort of water flows would be optimal to release the virus? So very tactical questions about, the actual release, how you would actually do it logistically.
Okay. And also, is the herpes virus similar to like a human herpes virus in that how is it caught? How do carp catch it from one another? Is it an STI?
That's a great question, Claire. So, not really. So we're going to verify this in laboratory experiments, but it's not a waterborne virus. The fish need to physically touch each other. So a bit like how we get cold sores and
fish kissing.
It's a little bit like fish kissing. So they develop lesions around their gills, and when other fish come into contact with that, that's where the virus is being excreted. And so physical contact will transmit the virus from infected fish to susceptible fish.
Right, okay. So it isn't something that's waterborne. It's not something that's going to be as easy as put it in the water and it'll go.
No, so we would be releasing live infectious fish.
At certain places.
Right.
Yeah. You are listening to Lost in Science on the Community Radio Network, and my guest today is Dr. Stephen Davis from RMIT University, and we are talking about the potential carp cleanup project on the Murray-Darling. So, Stephen, you're in Forbes last week for a meeting of the great minds of this project. Tell us what it was about and what sort of discussions are happening at the moment.
Yeah, so several of the scientists went to Forbes, and we were really trying to get to know the local fishermen and the local people who would be involved in any cleanup operation. Should we release the virus? It's not a done deal, Claire. There is a lot of legislative processes to go through before we can even think about releasing this virus. And
That's just great that this is all happening before it's even on the table as
Yeah.
a potential thing.
yeah.
I mean, you need as much information as possible.
Yeah. So actually, this is the most science that has gone into a decision-making process for any biocontrol agent anywhere in the world.
Wow.
So Australia is actually kind of leading the way in terms of looking at the science and advising the decision makers on whether it's a good, whether it's a good decision or not.
So you're saying we've come a long way since the cane toads?
Yes. We do not release vertebrate biocontrol agents anymore. We still release invertebrates, and obviously we're considering releasing a virus.
So you're in Forbes, and you're talking to community members and farmers as well. Did you say?
Yeah, local fishermen actually.
And local fishermen.
Yeah.
And how are they responding to it? What's the community saying?
Yeah, I've got to say it's extremely positive. It's surprisingly how into these people are in terms of releasing the virus and reducing the abundance of carp. And I guess that's a sign of how horrible they are and how detrimental they are to our rivers. So people are really for releasing the virus and reducing the impacts of the carp and having a healthier river.
You're in Forbes because this is the potential first place that the virus is
Yeah,
going to be released.
that's
Is that
right.
is that right?
Yeah, so if it goes ahead, it will be first released in the Lachlan catchment. And so the meeting was really about if there was a mass die-off of the fish and the natural river system didn't absorb those decaying fish, how could we clean up any, the
Excess?
dead carp, excess dead carp?
In how many trucks are you going to need?
Yeah, so questions around, how many tons of carp are we going to have to get rid of? And look, it's interesting because these people have seen mass die-offs of carp before. It's a highly ephemeral river system. Over 70% of the river system will dry up. So that's what I mean by ephemeral. It comes and goes. There are wet periods, there are dry periods. And
There are carp periods, there are non-carp periods.
Yeah. So it's during the flooding events that carp really take off and spread throughout the river and
Right.
And invade. Yeah. But during the dry periods, they will overnight have masses of dead fish, and it's not because the water completely dries up. It's because the oxygen levels drop down too low.
So dead fish means less oxygen in the water.
So one of the big concerns around the release of the virus is if you do get build-up of decaying carp, that decaying process can suck the oxygen out of the water. And in that case, it kills everything, not just the carp, but the native
other
fish.
10 to 20%
Yes.
of biomass,
Whatever's left.
whatever's left.
So that's really a concern. And the potential cleanup is about avoiding that sort of drop in oxygen levels. But it's also about, taking care of water quality, because a lot of people use the water from the river as their source of drinking water. So it's absolutely important that we protect those sources of water, and we protect the sensitive areas, which are breeding habitat for the native fish. Wherever there might be high ecological impact, we've been thinking about what a cleanup operation would look like.
And I have to ask, so if the government takes everything that you've said and all the scientists have said on board and, the necessary legislative things are put in place, what sort of timeline for the release are we looking at?
Yeah, sure. So we have to prepare our advice by the end of this year. And then the leader of this national carp control plan, a guy called Matt, will put it all together and advise the government on whether to release or not. So the earliest would be 2019, probably late in 2019. But I've got to say, Claire, we have to get agreement across a huge number of
Stakeholders.
including organisations like the EPA, and so
It's a long process.
one thing I realised was that the science we're doing is actually relatively easy compared to the kind of negotiations that we'll have to go on to ensure everybody is happy and satisfied with the legislation requirements around cost-benefit analyses, risk analysis. There's a whole bunch of things that have to be done. So, at the earliest it would be 2019, but it's probably later.
Well, Stephen, thank you so much for coming in today and letting me carp on about Carpageddon. Sorry, I'm sure you've heard that a million times.
I haven't actually.
And I'm really looking forward to seeing what the scientific analysis and what the modelling about releasing the carp virus, herpes virus, turns out to be. So it'll be great to have you in the future when some of your modelling is released as well.
You're very welcome, Claire. It's been great.
That's all we've got time for on this episode of Lost in Science. Thanks for tuning in and joining us. Lost in Science is recorded at the studios of 3CR in Melbourne and broadcast across Australia on the Community Radio Network with the financial assistance of the Community Broadcasting Foundation. If you want to talk to us, talk back to us, you can get in touch. We have a Gmail account, lostinsight@gmail. You can also find us on Twitter and on the Facebook. And if that's not enough Lost in Science for you, you can always tune in again next week where the team will once again get Lost in Science!
Thanks for listening to a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online.